I'm joined now by Congressman Daniel Goldman. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for doing it in person, Brian. Good to see you.
So we have heard for years now this obsession by Republicans with focusing on protecting children. It's the basis of QAnon. We've heard this numerous times from Republican lawmakers, Republican senators. Right now, we've just seen how Donald Trump has basically given leeway for Andrew Tate and his brother to come from Romania, where they were charged with rape and sex trafficking, back to the U.S., basically to give them passage back to the U.S. and extradite them from where they had been charged. Can I have your response to that? Because it doesn't seem that the rhetoric here is actually matching up with their actions.
No, and that's consistent with Donald Trump, which is that the law should apply to those who do not support him, who do not believe in him, who are not him or his allies, but they should not apply to his allies. And the Tate brothers have become sort of MAGA online sensations, very supportive of Donald Trump, and therefore, Donald Trump wants to help them, notwithstanding the fact, the allegations against them are horrific. And that's separate and apart from just the disgusting, unrelenting misogyny that comes from them online. The sex trafficking, rape, organized crime, money laundering, that's in Romania. There are also charges in England as well. And Donald Trump literally forced Romania to let them out of the country to fly back to the United States, knowing full well they'll never return to face charges. So he's protecting sexual child predators when we hear so much from the Republicans about how they're concerned about it. It's once again, I get tired of saying this, but it's hypocrisy to the nth degree.
What do you make of the conspicuous silence from your Republican colleagues? For many of whom have made this their primary issue, their entire MO. And this goes from, the online influencers, the libs of TikToks of the world, all the way up to members of Congress. And yet now, when we're seeing the stuff that they had basically fear-mongered about for so long, even in just this nebulous theoretical sense, when they've done all that fear-mongering, now when we actually have it occurring in practice, there's just crickets from the right.
Crickets, not only that, there's also replatforming by Elon Musk and by others. Andrew Tate was banned from Twitter for 5 years. Musk buys it, puts him back on, and that's how online predators operate, through digital media, through social media platforms. And so you have these people who profess to care so much about our children and online predators silent. And that's the case with all of the Republicans for the last 2 months. They are handing over all of their own authority to Donald Trump, and to bend the knee, to kiss up to him. I don't quite understand why, but they are undermining their own very existence here in Congress by just being silent and acquiescent to let him do whatever he wants to do.
And we're seeing it not just with issues regarding Andrew Tate. For example, the blow up in the Oval Office between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky. A lot of these Republicans who'd come out, who were willing, who had deigned to acknowledge objective reality about Russia being the aggressor in this war, because that's what happened, are now not even willing to go far enough to say that anymore. We saw that with Trump's Deputy Secretary of Defense nominee, who just wouldn't answer Senator Mark Kelly when he asked them who was the aggressor. And so what do you make of the fact that on all of these issues, Republicans are basically rewriting history just to comport with his political ideology, his political agenda?
These have become litmus tests to work in the Trump administration. You have to say that the 2020 election was stolen. You have to say that January 6th was a nice walk in the park. You have to say that Ukraine, not Russia, was the aggressor. And so you have Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who had been one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine when he was in the Senate, now completely flip-flopping 4 weeks after he gets into office, and just parroting Donald Trump's total BS about how somehow Ukraine was the aggressor, that Zelensky's a dictator. Let's be real. Vladimir Putin is a despot. He's a tyrant. And he is trying to reform the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, by overtaking Ukraine, the democratic country. And it's not just Ukraine that he's going against, it's all of Western democracy, because once Ukraine falls and we allow it to fall, that gives clear path for Russia, for China, for Iran, for North Korea to become a lot more aggressive while we're retreating.
Can you speak on that a little bit? Because the reality is that what we're doing right now is more of a handout to countries like China than anything that we could do otherwise. And so these are the same people who fearmonger so frequently about China being able to dominate the US. And yet when we cede our international standing in the world to China, just recently we saw that when we rescind funding for USAID, the country that fills that vacuum is China. And so can you talk about the dichotomy between their rhetoric, their anti-China rhetoric, versus what their actual actions are that lend itself to really Chinese ascendancy in the world at the risk of Americans retreating?
There are a couple components to this. The first is just from a military perspective. If Donald Trump takes the United States on a completely isolationist path and says, whatever problems are away from our borders are not our problems. They're Europe's problems, they're other people's problems. If there isn't the threat that the United States will support democracies around the world, you can bet China will be going into Taiwan within months. Right. Russia will not stop at Ukraine. They will continue. And so just from a national security perspective, we're going to see these authoritarian states making much more aggressive moves while we retreat, and democracy will suffer. But there's an economic component to this as well, which you touched upon. China and the United States are battling for economic supremacy all over the world, in Africa, in South America, in the Middle East, you name it, all over the place. Part of the reason why these emerging market countries in Africa and South America and elsewhere want the United States to invest in them is because they believe that the United States is the most powerful nation in the world and will not only help them economically, but will also support them from a national security or international security perspective.
Right.
If we don't offer that to them, and they can't be sure that we will have their back if they get into trouble, that creates another reason for them to go with China instead of going with us. And that will allow China to economically take over, to rise above us economically, but also that will bring them the soft power that we're giving up. And that soft power has a lot more influence than Donald Trump recognizes.
And so why does this matter? I mean, you're going to have, it's always a heavy lift trying to convince people that foreign relations matters anyway. And so if you're a regular American who isn't interested in the broader implications of basically relinquishing our soft power on the world, how does this actually impact Americans here at home?
Well, one of the examples I always like to give is when there was that swap of between Russia and the United States to get Paul Whelan back and a few other prisoners, illegally held prisoners from Russia. Vladimir Putin insisted on getting a treacherous murderer from Germany back. And Germany was not really getting anything from the deal. And Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor, tells a story how they were in the Situation Room trying to finalize the deal with President Biden and Olaf Scholz, the prime minister of Germany. And at one point toward the end, Olaf Scholz says, "Joe, I'll do it for you." That's what alliances bring us, is that when you need something from a friend, and we will need something from other people, they will be there. Israel will be in much more danger if the United States recedes from Europe, because Iran will know that there's only so far the United States will go. The U.S. support for Israel is what has generally propped Israel up in the Middle East. Taiwan is the same way, but then all of Europe. So we break down our agreements with, our alliances with Europe, and we're not going to get support from them when we need it, either economically. And so it will take a little while for this to have an impact. It's not like the cost of eggs, right. But ultimately we become a lot less safe. And even more so, if we're not sharing information with our allies, we are not getting intelligence from our allies that we need. we become less safe. Terrorists will be able to come in and conspire to commit terrorist attacks in this country because we don't have the intelligence that we used to.
To that point, a lot of what we're seeing at the FBI right now is between Cash Patel, Pam Bondi, Dan Bongino. We're seeing these folks really focus on those who are in the U.S. critical of this administration. Ed Martin, U.S. Attorney from D.C., has been especially focused on basically responding to any Trump critics on Twitter who are fed to him through these different right-wing influencers or elected officials. And so when we have our resources going toward that, given the limited resources we have at the FBI, at our law enforcement agencies, what falls off the wayside as a result of that?
Well, one thing that will be almost destroyed is going to be our rule of law. And secondarily, national security. And what I mean by that is, if they are focused on politicizing law enforcement and focus on Donald Trump's enemies and preserving and saving Donald Trump's allies, they are also undermining the credibility of everything that they're doing. And I was a prosecutor for 10 years. We rely very heavily in the FBI on confidential sources, confidential informants. The intelligence community. This goes back to what I was saying about how important it is for us to get access to intelligence and that to be used properly. If it's not used properly, no one will want to be a source because they'll be burnt.
Yeah.
And our allies will not want to give us information because their sources will be burnt. That makes us less safe. In addition, it undermines the very credibility and fabric of what's going on. It will enable Donald Trump's buddies to break the law, to commit fraud, to push corporate greed way, way, way past the norm. And there's no accountability for them. There'll be no enforcement of that. And there won't be the effort that really has to go into protecting our communities. The FBI works hand in hand with local law enforcement all the time to on task forces to combat gun violence, to tackle organized crime and gangs. If they're spending, Ed Martin is spending his resources on writing letters to members of Congress who insulted Elon Musk, he's not spending his time on prosecuting actual crime. And that will allow the criminals to get more emboldened and commit more crimes.
And finally, I want to talk about Social Security, because that's an issue, obviously, that a huge swath of Americans are focused on right now. We've seen reporting that the Social Security Administration is about to be halved. These are the folks who work in the department to administer Social Security. So what are the implications of the possible gutting that we're about to see on the Social Security Administration and for Social Security itself?
Well, ultimately, this is all part of the Republicans' effort to eliminate government programs that are designed to be a safety net and to give people a little bit of a boost so that they can get access to the American dream. Social Security, as we know, you pay into it over the course of your career and then you get it back at the end. This is not an entitlement. It's something that earned.
Yeah.
And by cutting it in half, you are effectively making the Social Security Administration so ineffective that it will not be able to do its job. And people will not get the benefits that they deserve. 1 in 5 Americans receive Social Security benefits, either for disability or retirement. And if you cut this by half, you are making it nearly impossible for people to get timely service, timely checks, registration. There are all sorts of issues that come with registering for Social Security. I was talking to a constituent of mine today whose last name is spelled one letter off on his Social Security card than on the rest of his ID. He has been trying for months to get his Social Security card updated with its proper name. He can't even get anybody there to help him. And that's before the 50% cuts.
So what do you say to those Trump voters out there who, look, they were sold to Bell Goods? I mean, they were promised that he would focus on the cost of housing, the cost of rent, the cost of food, the cost of the eggs. I mean, that's almost become a joke akin to how infrastructure week was, some big promise during his first term. And what they're getting instead is this relentless focus on eliminating people who are going to free his buddies who were under investigation or who were being prosecuted. We're getting January 6th insurrection is free. We're getting, the dismantling of NATO and the post-war alliance that's led to the longest period of peace and prosperity in modern world history, and no focus on any of the things that all these people thought that they were voting for.
I think that is what the American people need to understand. My understanding of the election, based on exit polls, is that the American people felt, the working class Americans, the middle class, felt like Donald Trump was going to be better for them than what they were under the Biden administration.
Yeah.
And that the costs will go down, wages will go up, that their lives will be more affordable. There isn't a single action that Donald Trump has taken in the flurry of actions that he and Elon Musk have taken that is actually addressing the cost of rent, the cost of eggs, the cost of healthcare, the cost of prescription drugs. In fact, the only things that he has done that address those have increased those costs. Now he's adding tariffs against our ally Canada to the north, from whom we import a tremendous amount of goods.
Metals, lumber, pharmaceuticals, food.
Yeah, energy, the list goes on. And if those tariffs are going to be paid by the American people, make no mistake, Donald Trump is lying. He is gaslighting the American people when he says those foreign countries are going to pay those tariffs. That's not true. The corporations actually have to pay the tariffs, and then they pass it through to the customers. In addition, you're going to get a trade war. So Canada is now going to increase tariffs, put tariffs on all sorts of goods that we get from, or that they get from us. And so it's going to dramatically increase prices, and it's going to raise inflation. And Donald Trump promised the exact opposite. What he did not win on, and let's be very clear, is dismantling our democracy, undermining our rule of law, gutting the federal government, just arbitrarily gutting the federal government. And I'm all for getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. We should do that. We should spend more time on that. We should use technology to do it. But under what circumstances do you ever identify a program with a keyword in an algorithm and then shut it down and then say, all right, well, maybe we ought to see if we really need this or not? That's what Elon Musk is doing. There's no way he knows that anything is waste, fraud, or abuse based on the amount of time and the methodology that he's using. And so what is happening is people are getting hurt, and they will continue to get hurt. And it's not just the Social Security Administration. It is any number of different programs that Medicaid now, through the budget process, they have to cut Medicaid.
Right.
Be very clear. They will say, oh, no, we didn't do anything with the budget. We didn't. The only way to meet the requirements for how much money must be cut from the budget is to cut Medicaid. Not fraud, not Medicaid fraud. Cut Medicaid benefits or Medicare. Take your pick, one or the other. It has to be. And so what they are doing is essentially gutting all of the government programs, gutting the budget that hundreds of millions of Americans rely on. And then you might say, oh, well, that's because they're trying to reduce the deficit. No, they're not. They're only doing this so that they can cut taxes for billionaires, for Elon Musk, for Donald Trump, for their buddies. And that is actually going to increase the deficit overall by up to $2 trillion more because of the tax cuts for the wealthy. So they are gutting what middle-class Americans depend on in order to help the wealthiest 1%.
And that really is the ultimate irony of all of this, because all of this is being done under the pretense that we have to get our out-of-control debt under control. And yet all they're going to do with taking away these either earned benefit programs or entitlement programs and then use that to try and offset a $4.5 trillion tax cut that won't come close to offsetting that amount of money, is only going to add to the deficit, which is only going to add more money to the actual debt itself. So all of this is being done kind of, I guess, under the guise of waste, fraud, and abuse, cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. But at the end of the day, that does nothing for any of those things.
Yeah.
Let's finish off with this. While you're talking about the different ways in which Trump is kind of taking an axe to every aspect of the federal government, on which a lot of Americans, hundreds of millions of Americans rely. What is your message to folks who see this happening and kind of do feel, hopeless out there at what we're seeing, and helpless in terms of whether we can actually do anything to stop it?
Well, I think there are two different groups of people right now on both sides of the spectrum. There are those who think that Donald Trump is tackling waste, fraud, and abuse. Maybe it's not exactly the way I would want to do it, but he's doing it. He's actually not. He is just arbitrarily gutting things, and he's canceling contracts. That, including, by the way, collective bargaining agreements. He is breaching collective bargaining agreements with unions throughout the country. By doing that, he is jeopardizing the certainty that our country is founded upon based on the rule of law. And that when you and I sign a contract, that we have to follow that contract, or one of us breaches it and there are legal recourses. Donald Trump is just slashing and breaking contracts, which means that you could say, well, the president broke a contract. I don't mind if I do. What's going to happen to me? I don't have to follow the law. That will absolutely destroy our economy, and that will mean people lose jobs, that people really suffer. So those are people who kind of, I think, feel like, well, there's some movement, that's good. But really what it is incredibly dangerous. Then there are understandably people who are throwing their hands up because the Republican majority in Congress is doing absolutely nothing to provide a check and a balance. Right. What I can say is this. First of all of these lawless actions are going to the courts, and it remains to be seen how it all plays out in the courts. But there are a number of courts that are that recognize that this is reckless and arbitrary and capricious and lawless, and they're at least putting a temporary stop on it so they can evaluate whether or not it is a legitimate action or not. So that's important. Now, what we're going to start seeing, beginning with March 14th, is legislation, and they're going to have to come through Congress. They are going to have to fund the government past March 14th. And notoriously, the Republicans are incapable of funding the government themselves. So if they come to us, the Democrats, to help them fund the government, fine. But if you want it to be bipartisan, then it's going to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
We are not going to just hand over the keys to the kingdom after Donald Trump has taken our appropriations that we agreed on and just slashed it. Why would we ever trust him to use the money that we appropriate properly unless we get more certainty and more guarantees? And if it's going to be bipartisan, we're going to insist on getting some of our own priorities in there. So there is an opportunity for us to use our leverage that's coming up very soon.
All right. Well, Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Good to see you.